So, I've got a series of readings that I've been doing on books and pamphlets and papers about eugenics from about 100 years ago. And I'm doing this because it's interesting to me to see the kind of ideas that were flourishing amongst the Anglo-British, American Anglo-British elites, the intellectual class, before World War II. It appears to me that there's basically just like a cutoff point. The kind of ideas that were circulating were different before and after, and the end of the war marks a point of no return. Um, the rationalization for this that you'll hear in the mainstream is that after the National Socialists in Germany were defeated, it became apparent that eugenics was discredited, that anything like any kind of eugenics was just Nazi stuff. Even though the National Socialists in Germany did not originate eugenics policies, it was an Anglo-British policy that was basically carried out in the United States, Britain, Canada, Australia, and these kind of places. That's where pretty much all of the work on eugenics was, all the research was done, and all the stuff was actually carried out. So it's kind of weird that the mainstream history version of things would put that on Nazi Germany, because it's not really appropriate. However, it's no surprise that such a thing would be done, because it's really all about using whatever thing you've currently got going on as an excuse for whatever else you want to do. So what we see, there is a bit of a relationship here. So eugenics has to be a nationalist program. Eugenics has to be a nationalist program because the goal of eugenics is to improve the genetic character or genetic ability of the nation. And so I would ask you, who benefits from improving the overall genetic character of the nation itself? It's not even really going to be anyone who's alive today. All the benefits are going to be felt, 25, 30, 50, 100 years in the future. Eugenics is very attractive as a discipline because once you lock these improvements down, it's basically like, your people get to keep them forever because they carry all that stuff forward into the future. So I would say that eugenics is nationalist and it is an investment. It's not a get rich quick scheme, and it's something that you do now for the future. So in those ways, it's good. Most of the objections to eugenics are going to be that, you just want to kill mentally disabled people, or you want to kill undesirables and all that kind of stuff. Even though, if you listen to the recordings that I did, hold on just a second. If you listen to the recordings, then you'll find that there are different types of eugenic practices that can be implemented, and the authors, I think, to a man, say that they don't actually want to start exterminating people. And Leonard Darwin, in the first paper that I read, the speech that he gave in 1912, I believe it was, he said that he's even reticent to try to discourage mentally disabled people from getting married and having kids, because any barrier thrown up to marriage is going to potentially damage the ethical character of the nation, and it's going to encourage these second order and third order effects that are going to be deleterious. So the version of the mainstream objections to eugenics, which is like, hey, you just want to kill these people, that doesn't have to be the way that it is. Doesn't have to be that way. And to the extent that some of these mentally disabled people were killed in Nazi Germany, well, I mean, maybe that's not a good thing, but that doesn't have to be the way it would have to be carried out. And if you ground it in a firmly nationalistic context, then I would say something like, you don't want to be killing your own people because they're your people. You want to defend your own people. And I think that let me back up a second. So after the end of after the end of World War II, the nationalist group of political ideologies was basically discredited and crushed. It was discredited because the two groups that won were firmly opposed to nationalism, and it was crushed because the most powerful nationalist countries in the world were defeated and subjected to other political orders. The replacement ideology, the dominant ideologies, the ones that won, were Western, liberal, capitalist democracy and international communism. Both of those ideologies are completely opposed to eugenic practices. In the case of the Western liberal democracies, they are opposed to eugenics because their basic function is that political actors have short time horizons. They're not interested in the qualities of the nation as a group of people. They're short-term thinkers, short-term economic benefits. They're rent seekers. Basically, like the worst kind of political incentives that you could come up with. And one of the biggest problems is that they're vulnerable to capture, institutional capture by bankers and big corporations and vested interests, elite interests. So there's no real reason in Western liberal capitalist democracy for the political elites to work on behalf of the nation. And the proof is in the pudding. They never do, right? Western liberal democracies, for example, are famous, at least in our era, for importing low-skilled workers, which drives down the wages for the native population. They are famous for expansionary military escapades, which send the young men of their nations off to die for God knows what purpose. And you could come up with, any number of examples for this. So basically, my claim here is that the Western liberal democracies have absolutely no interest in eugenic practices because eugenics benefits the nation, and Western liberal democracies don't care about the nation. They just care about profits for the elites and this kind of stuff, whoever's in charge. So the other winner from World War II was the international communism. International communism and all the varieties of non-national leftism are completely opposed to eugenics because the purpose of eugenics, as I said, is to increase the genetic abilities or characteristics of your nation. If you are an internationalist, you do not want to make any group better. You want to make all groups the same. This is why every single NGO or your basic shitlib or just any of these basic leftists that you'll run into, they're not interested in making America greater if they're Americans or making Germany greater if they're Germans. They really just want to go find a place that's doing really poorly and try to improve it. And their method for doing so is usually to take money away from people who are doing well and spend it on people who are doing poorly. So what the eugenics people want to do is say, here's our nation, we want to increase it, and we don't really care about the rest of the world. What the leftists want to do is say, here's our nation, here's some country that's not doing very poorly, and they want to balance those out. They want to take away from the people who have a lot of educational capital or money or whatever and use that to raise everybody else up until they get to fairness, equality, social justice, which is everybody being the same. Now, the problem, and you can see this really clearly with the Russian version of communism, is that this never actually took place. All of the wealth of Tsarist imperial Russia was robbed, and it wasn't robbed in order to bring the peasants up. They were mostly, turned into rats in cages for the most part. They were brought from the countryside into the cities and crammed into, disgusting living conditions in factories in order to produce the industrialization that the political ideology demanded. They had to create workers for the workers' state because there were no workers in the workers' state. 90% of the people there were rural people. They weren't workers. They were agriculturalists. They were peasants. They were doing fine. So in both of these cases, when the nationalists lose, eugenics as a discipline, as a research field, as a practical policy is stamped out. Now, all of the people who were interested in eugenics, who came up in the 19 teens, 20s, and 30s or whatever, they did not drop their eugenics policies. They continued to work for this stuff. However, there was no new recruitment. So whereas in Cambridge in the 1910s and 19aughts, teens, 20s, you would have young undergraduates and graduate students and professors who were all working in the field of eugenics. You no longer had that recruitment after the end of World War II because this stuff was taboo. So eugenics kind of turns into like this backwater that you would have to be a racist in order to be interested in. Now, Western liberal capitalist democracies and the internationalist left have this conceit, or I guess we could really call it the egalitarian hoax. And I think I took that phrase from a paper, but I can't remember the name of the author. Maybe I could find that and put it in the description. Maybe you could just look it up. You'd probably come across it. But the egalitarian hoax is that people are all the same. And since people are all the same, we can create the international workers' paradise, or we can just put democracy anywhere, and democracy will bring about all the benefits. Because if people are all the same and democracy is the best, then it'll work anywhere all the time. But there is probably, like, let's say up until 1960, they had about 70 years of research to show that people are not all the same. So what you had was a big conflict between people who'd been doing research on human biodiversity by using psychometrics and intelligence testing that showed that people weren't really the same, and then all of the elites in America and in Western Europe, basically, who've gotten on board with this new project, saying people are all the same, we're just going to either spread democracy or communism and everything's going to work out fine. Just to show you, this is a bit off topic, but we'll do it anyway, just to show you how wild and crazy this stuff was, I got a book that I bought for $3.50. Okay, so like that's the price of shipping, right? So I got this book for free, basically. I just had to pay for shipping. This book is called The Testing of Negro Intelligence. This book is written by a female psychologist. Her name was Audrey Shuey. She published this book, the second edition, in 1966. The first edition was in 1958. And the point of this book, or what this book is a compilation of just under 400 studies that were done from, I think, 1920 up until 1960. 400 studies. And let me tell you, they all find the exact same thing. I'm sorry. They don't all find the exact same thing. This is basically a meta-analysis. You take 400 studies, you put them all in similar criteria. You say, what do they all look at that's the same, and what can we infer from all of this research? And the results are very stable, and they're the same results that you would have found in 1910, 1950, 1980, and 2018. And it's that white Americans and African Americans, black people in America, have a difference of about one standard deviation separating them in terms of intelligence testing. White Americans, if they're the mean, they have an IQ of 100. What you do is whatever the reference population is for some testing in IQ, that's what 100 is. So if you went and you tested 100 Africans in Africa, it would be 100. If you tested 100 New Guineans in New Guinea, it would be 100. 100 Chinese, if you tested Chinese in China, it would be 100. So if white Americans are the reference point, you will find from 400 studies from 1910 up until 2018, whatever you want to look for, a difference of about 15 points, which is the one standard deviation. So I'm going to read you a little bit from the introduction to this book, which is written, I believe it was Henry Garrett wrote this, and then I want you to just ask yourself, is this written by rampaging evil Nazi racists, or is this written just by psychologists doing scientific research and this is just what they found? So this is Henry Garrett, who is a professor, full professor of psychology at Columbia University. The question of Negro-white differences in mental test performance has been the subject of lively debate in recent years. This is from 1966. We're talking about the Civil Rights Movement. Unfortunately, the subject has often been confused with social and political issues of racial inferiority, desegregation, civil rights, and other extraneous matters. Moreover, a number of well-meaning but often insufficiently informed writers have taken the untenable position that racial differences ought not to be found, or, if found, should immediately be explained away as somehow immoral and reprehensible. With this attitude, I am in sharp disagreement. I welcome every honest effort to help Negroes improve their lot. So I welcome every honest effort to help Negroes improve their lot, but I do not believe it is necessary to prove that no racial differences exist, nor to conceal and gloss them over if found, in order to justify a fair policy toward Negroes. The honest psychologist, like any true scientist, should have no preconceived racial bias. The honest psychologist, like any true scientist, should have no preconceived racial bias. He should not care which race, if any, is superior in intelligence, nor shall he demand that all races be potentially equal. He is interested simply in uncovering differences and in performance when such exist, and in inferring the origin of these differences. And this is certainly a legitimate scientific enterprise. So that's what he said. Let's see here. See if I can find a conclusion. But you basically just have to, the question is really like, is this guy lying and is he an evil racist? And, 400 studies were all just made up. I've even had libraries send me dissertations or master's theses that were done in the 1920s and 30s that aren't even talked about, that aren't even looked at or reported, and they show the exact same thing. So if you think that there was, in fact, a conspiracy across 60 years for all these people to make up these results, and they happen to pretty much always find the exact same thing, I guess you could say that. But okay, so this is the concluding statement to the book here. This is by the author. The remarkable consistency in test results, whether they pertain to school or preschool children, to children ages between 6 to 9, 10 to 12, children in grades 1 to 3 or 4 to 7, to high school or college students, to enlisted men or officers in training in the armed forces in World War I, II, or the post-Korean period. So she's just listing all of the groups who were tested in this book. They're all broken up into these categories. Sorry, I got interrupted yet again. To sum up, she talks about all of the different categories of evidence that have been covered in the book, all the different categories in terms of north-south differences, the age groups, the occupational groups, veteran status, all this stuff. And then she says, all taken together, these inevitably point to the presence of native differences between Negroes and whites as determined by intelligence tests. So why am I talking about this book? Well, in, I think it was 1993, Charles Murray and Richard Herrnstein, posthumously for Herrnstein, but Charles Murray published this book called The Bell Curve. Now, the bell curve contained these same kinds of findings, and it was a huge intellectual debacle, basically, because everybody from the media world, the social justice world, all of these public figures, they all said this stuff is bunk, it's been disproven, it's racist, it's evil, etc., etc. The only thing that those guys did in that book, well, they did a lot of interesting stuff, but the main bone of contention was that they resurrected the same kind of testing and the same kind of results that were already documented in, like 400 studies up to 1966. This stuff was nothing new. So it's really just like a judgment on the egalitarian hoax, as I would call it, which says that there can be no innate genetic differences between people that have social ramifications. Because you can look already at different different groups in human society, racial or ethnic groups, and say, this group's skin is generally darker, or these people over here are generally taller, or the width of this group's pelvis is, these people have wider pelvis bones, or something like that. So we know that the differences exist. The question is, well, it's not a question, the argument is over, are there any of these differences that exist that have social ramifications? And the most important one, obviously, being intelligence. So you've got, 60 years of research that says that it did, pardon me, and then that whole research program is just basically shut down. So you can see in both of these cases, with eugenics and with the intelligence testing, that it was not really that the research program, that the agenda was no good or that the ideas were no good. It was that the groups that won, the groups that controlled the world after the end of World War II, had no interest in these ideas. Not on the basis of their merit, but merely on the basis of the political utility of these programs and what these elites wanted to do in the world. I know this was a long one and covered a lot of different stuff here, but I see this as all basically part of the same thing. And it's our job to do what Henry Garrett said in the beginning of the introduction to this book, and it's not to shy away from things that may be true, but we don't want them to be true, but they may be true anyway. It's our job to assess the world and figure out what the world really is, and then try to do the best thing. If we want to live in a better world, and that's what everybody says that they want to do. So those are my thoughts on that. Thank you for your time.